Hello, and welcome to the DTP Show, a production of the Design Theory and Pedagogy program at SCI-Arc. I'm going to redo that.
As we say in SCI-Arc channel, take two.
Hi, welcome to the DTP Show, a production of the Design Theory and Pedagogy postgraduate program at SCI-Arc. The Design Theory and Pedagogy program is a one-year course that equips graduates with the necessary skills to launch an academic career. Public speaking in the form of lectures, conferences, and symposia is one of the most important formats for the public intellectual. The DTP Show is curated by the students of the DTP class of 2021. Each student has invited one speaker who has been influential on their thinking over the last year. These guests will be in dialogue with the student around topics both central and tangential to their research and pedagogies. The interaction with practicing theorists and practitioners is sure to be an entertaining and enlightening set of discussions. Thanks for joining us. Our first panel features the work of student Reza Salehi and architect and educator Marceline Gao. Reza's work on educational systems has been designed in response to the observation of the existing educational system, which shows a lack of thematic and cultural diversity in history theory courses and architectural students, both rooted in the colonial heritage of our educational system. In his pedagogy, instead of language such as foreign, alien, or even third world, the important first act is the recognition of the other as other. Pedagogically, the active principle is to learn from instead of learn about or discovering the other. Marceline Gao is a principal of Servo Los Angeles, a design collaborative invested in the development of architectural environments integrating synthetic ecologies with shifting material states. Gao received her architecture degrees from the Architectural Association and Columbia University, as well as a doctorate from the ETH Zurich. Her dissertation, Invisible Environment, Art, Architecture, and a Systems Aesthetic, explores the relationship between aesthetic research and technological innovation. Gao has lectured internationally and contributed to numerous journals, including Perspecta, VIA, and AD. She's the co-editor of Material Beyond Materials and On-Ramp 4. Gao was the recipient of a 2012 Graham Foundation grant to individuals and a 2014-15 City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs Visual Artist Fellowship. She currently teaches design studios and critical theory seminars at SCI-Arc and is the coordinator of the Design Theory and Pedagogy program. Reza Salehi is a student of the Design Theory and Pedagogy program at SCI-Arc. He received his MArch 1 from SCI-Arc in 2020. Prior to immigrating to the United States in 2013, he received his bachelor's degree in conservation of art objects from Isfahan University of Arts in 2008 and worked for 5 years as a painter conservator in Isfahan museums, as well as teaching art history. His research over the past year has focused on the decolonization of the architectural education system in countries with a colonial heritage by extending the field of study in architectural history courses and studios to other cultures, learning from instead of learning about or discovering others. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Reza, who's going to give us a presentation of his research, and then we will have our discussion.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Reza, and first of all, thank you all for being here. I appreciate your time. Let me share my screen and present my work. Okay. Learning instead of discovery. Let me start with my statement. Observation of existing educational system shows a lack of thematic and cultural diversity in history theory courses and architecture studios indicates the colonial heritage in our pedagogy system. Edward Said believes that the West operates through two mechanisms in relationship to the rest of the world. First, through the act of telling people who they are, and the second, by telling people how to represent themselves through images and forms of knowledge. The proposed alternative pedagogical system is formulated as a critical response to these two mechanisms. This proposed pedagogy is not intended to provide an answer to how the West should relate to the rest of the world. It is rather a focused experiment in an alternative. To know and learn from other culture, the first step is to surrender the position of power. My premise is the first step would be to negate any sense of privilege and correctness. In other words, instead of language such as foreign, line, or even third word, the important first act is the recognition of the others as others. Pedagogically, the active principle is to learning from instead of learning about or discovering the other. I want to avoid an anthropological approach to other culture which assume privileged point of view. Rather, I want to promote a more basic curiosity and openness to other cultures. Design influenced by other cultures does not mean selecting characteristic elements from that culture and using those elements in the design. Rather, on a more basic level, one can learn from how other cultures design and manage need. Without such insight become methodological, I think it is more important to focus on how the individual values of a student might evolve through such an encounter. According to the mentioned issue, in each semester, steps were taken to improve the existing educational system and finally to design an alternative system. In the first step, the SCI-Arc curriculum was considered as a sample and desired correction were made. This system tries to make a bridge between learning to design in the design studios and all of history aspects like its diversity and cultural context. To reach this goal, we need to redesign history courses as design studios to be more explicit and act on a designerly way. Design studios, history courses, and applied studies work in a collaborative way to produce a co-production intertwine. To achieve this goal, by integrating history and applied courses with architecture studios, a set of package was designed in which these three courses will work in harmony with each other and with a fixed topic and will provide class materials for each other. Also, as an example of the first semester, an attempt was made to design architectural history courses on the subject of social housing in Turkey with the help of the GAHTC curriculum concepts. Modern Turkey is often considered a bridge between East and West, or between Europe and the Middle East. But where does Europe geographically come to an end, and where the non-West begin? The fluidity of these terms indicates that what sounds like simple geographical descriptions at first, common to many architecture and art history books as well, are in fact historical, intellectual, and political constructs. These were drawn by Western scholars in the past 2 centuries. Studying housing in Turkey helped us unpack and challenge such divides. In the spring semester, I start with introducing some concepts from Arab culture and Iranian culture. Let me start with al-masha concept. The Arabic term of al-masha refers to many individual agriculture parcels that are shared and cultivated among a community of different farmers. This concept only exists when people decide to work the land together. If they stop cultivating, they will lose ownership as a result. So ownership only makes sense and is defined when shared. According to this thinker such as Lefebvre, the production of special forms and unequal distribution of means of production and capital is only one side of the coin of space production. Because on the other side is the creation of new space to change the previous order. This is done by changing, replacing, and seizing power by new political forces. In this process and construction, the former obedient and consumers become the producers of space. This means that users take over space and recreate it in pursuit of their needs and interests. If these changes occur profoundly, a new space will be established with a new social spatial order, resulting in a critical construction of space. The model presented in al-masha can fundamentally change the citizen-space-power relationship by disturbing existing patterns of permanent ownership of space and by providing temporary ownership based on agreement between citizens. In this semester, based on concept of al-masha, the pattern of using shared space and land in a village in the village of Mosul in Iran, as well as pattern of hashdi in and indirect access to a space in Iranian architecture, a recurring pattern was designed for a housing project in Los Angeles. As you can see, different way of putting this model together provides the ability to run a different housing project. During the final semester, I tried to put statement principles to a test. I myself selected a culture that I'm curious about, Colombia. I attempt to learn from Colombia and then initiate a design for a multi-family complex in a site near Dodger Stadium. This is the site near the Dodger Stadium, and this is Sunset Boulevard, and the yellow rectangle show the position of the site. In the history of site, we know that the houses of residents have been forcibly occupied. One of the strategies to capture homes was to buy them one by one at different prices. Developer offered immediate cash payment to residents for their property. They offered the remaining homeowner less money, so residents feared that if they held out, they wouldn't get a fair price. In other case, official uses the power of eminent domain to acquire plots of land and force residents out of their homes. They came up with a plan for a massive public housing project known as Elysian Park Heights, designed by architects Robert E. Alexander and Richard Neutron, and funded in the part of federal money. The project was supposed to include more than 1,000 units, 2,013-story buildings, and 162-story townhouse, as well as several new schools and playgrounds. Finally, On the Friday, May 9, 1959, bulldozers and sheriff's deputies showed up to forcibly evict the last few families in Chavez Ravines. Residents of area called it Black Friday. But instead of housing project, crews broke ground for Dodger Stadium, and 4 months later, on September 17, 1959, while it was being built, the Dodgers played games at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Let me very briefly share with you what I learned last semester and this semester from some other cultures. A little about Al-Masha concepts that I already explained, as well as a study of Colombian art and architecture. Different ancient, colonial, and modern periods can be identified in the history of Colombian architecture. In each period, its element and character features can be identified and tracked, such as the use of the central courtyard and elaborate decorations, which can be considered influenced by the architecture of southern Spain and the architecture of Muslim Arabs. But none of these are the subject of our work for this studio. I would like to introduce you to the most important question that Colombian architects and intellectuals are facing today. The famous question of who are we? Who deserve to try find the answer of this question? Is anyone but a Colombian architect and intellectual? This question was a spark for an architectural designer who did his best to stay away from producing and representing concepts derived from a culture. A plan that, apart from providing a template for its definition, simply provides the possibility and suitable space for discussion and exchange of views and accompaniment of votes. Sometimes, instead of providing a model and a structure for a community, a safe space can be created for a community to define itself. In this project, instead of defining identity by designing based on forms imported from another culture, by providing sufficient space for residents, it is possible to define an intertwined society by themselves. The intertwined neighborhood is much stronger than isolated units. And the shared use of land can be a solution to deal with external pressure for a neighborhood. The concepts you are looking is just coincidence. Cubes that have been rolled down the hillside like dice and each placed somewhere. The space created and corrected between them can be a space for gathering or cooking and dining together or other social activities and collective activities. The goal is to create an environment that allows for collective action and investment in creating a collective identity. These three units are separated, for example, and describe in more detail the idea of sharing space and housing more than one family in one cube. As you can see, on this cube, we have sharing the space with these two families. In the plan, you can see how the units are placed next to each other and the space is divided. and in the sections. And at the end, the view of project in the site. Thank you. Okay. Can I start with the questions?
Okay, Reza, thanks a lot. That was really great. It's been amazing to see your work evolve over the last year and really over the course of your career. So I guess I'll let you start a conversation with some additional thoughts and some questions for Marceline.
Sure, thank you. Let me bring another quote from Said. As Edward Said emphasized the inherent relationship between culture and imperialism, the empire institutionalized its domination through culture and deprives others from narration of their historical rights. I think it is very important that we try to provide a context for hearing the narration of others from their own point of view, not from the perspective of the empire and its defined channel of vision. We will eliminate the ground for the possibility of colonialism with this approach. From your perspective, Marceline, what is the importance of decolonization of architecture education in a society with a colonial heritage?
Reza, I also want to thank you for your thoughtful presentation. And I think you're raising several questions that are of particular relevance today for us in terms of thinking through our pedagogical models and how we teach both the design studios in architecture, but also how we teach the history and theory of architecture. And so I think the importance of examining a lot of the assumptions that one might make, especially when there is sort of a dominant cultural narrative that's being laid over a subject. And so even the aspect of the periodization of architectural history and the role of historiography, like how is history recorded, what is in the archive, what has been left out of the archive, these are really essential and fundamental questions that I think today there is much scholarship now being started, engaged in, as you mentioned in your presentation, the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, the GAHTC, has been really examining this question and not proposing that there's one model for, there's a kind of solution to this, but I think the main aspect that comes up to my mind is the decentering and the maybe reorienting for someone who is teaching that subject matter to say, how do I reorient myself? And I think that's what you in this, your fundamental theme, which is learning from rather than learning about or discovering. I think that's really clearly articulated by you, that to learn from, one has to, in a sense, abandon some of the preconceptions that one might have. One has to go into a sort of uncomfortable space, I would say, and to realize that one's sort of losing a kind of ground maybe momentarily, and that moment can sometimes be quite long. And I think that is something that we're currently experiencing. I think many educators at the moment. So I think this is quite relevant. I mean, it does bring to mind several other references. I'm thinking of bell hooks and in her book, Teaching to Transgress, and the way in which she places an emphasis on the learning community. And so that idea of the learning community, each member in that classroom is part of the learning community. So there is no longer a sort of hierarchy that's established between saying there's, one source of knowledge, and then that knowledge is kind of imparted and received by others, but that it's sort of a feedback loop between the teacher and the students, and that everyone is engaged in that learning community. And the other reference that comes to mind is Sarah Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology, Orientations, Objects, and Others, where Ahmed speaks about the situation when one becomes disoriented, and thinking of disorientation not necessarily as a negative position, but as something that's positive. And I think in your case, you would argue that actually brings new knowledge, that process of disorienting, decentering, that's how we begin to learn from. And of necessity, as the one who's learning, I undergo change through that process. And so my own identity changes. It's sort of like if you learn a new language, it can be, one has to become kind of humble. It's hard to express things at the beginning of that process. And that degree of discomfort is something that's part of that learning process. And so I guess, yeah, I'd also be curious where these moments of discomfort, how they might manifest themselves in the curriculum, either in the design studio or in the history theory curriculum. There's often as well the situation where the archives, as I was mentioning, there are many things that have been excluded. So if we go to the archive seeking knowledge, and we find that there are gaps, there are lacuna, there are missing items, how do we begin to contribute? Who do we begin to speak to? What stories need to be heard? What oral histories? What needs to be recorded and written about? And that's where I think maybe some of these contributions can be made. But I'd be curious, to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said. I think during the education, both teacher and student in this system, at least, both teacher and students will be in the same position in facing with new cultural phenomena. I mean, when they face to new phenomena from other cultures, both students and teachers should be open to learn and to find new way of thinking and new way of looking to worldview. For me, in this system, teacher is not, a teacher doesn't have a role of someone who knows everything and want to actually transfer his or her knowledge to their students. I mean, a teacher with a student will learn during the semester from a new culture, with having different exercises, different approach, and different method of learning. There are many options that maybe in the continue we will talk about that. For example, one of my main criticism of current architecture education system was exactly the gap between architecture studios and architecture history courses. While a constructive relationship between the two can strengthen the educational goals of both, there are different ways to do this. But what they all have in common is that they do not limit themselves to available resource and keep the learning window open. Fieldwork can reply to this question. I mean, fieldwork can play an important role in this educational model. Imagine how a trip to Mosul to understand the shared space between homes, or interview with residents and learn about their experience of living in such a space could deepen the view of students and faculty and their library studies. And continue, what is your opinion about this? How can we make this connection between historical theory courses and architecture studies?
I think that the issue of field work that you refer to is very, very important, because by constructing your own way to knowledge, you begin to circumvent some of those dominant narratives I was speaking about. So that if we would do research on Masala, and there are maybe a certain number of books that have been written, maybe some of those books are written by scholars in Iran, some in other countries, each one may present the concept of al-Masha from a different viewpoint, whereas you as the researcher or the student going to the site that you are studying and actually thinking about that site not as something fixed and inert, but that site is a whole constellation of human and non-human agents, of topographies, of geologies, histories, layers of history, and potential futures that will transpire. So that site is a kind of vibrant and living thing. And so I think the way in which you access that, so you could, you could survey land, you could look at satellite imagery of a city, you could interview inhabitants and hear about their experiences living in those spaces. There would be many different ways in which you could sort of know the site. Each one will have its limitations. Each medium will leave out certain kinds of information, certain kinds of data. You know, some of them might be more technological. You could do LiDAR scans of the existing context. You could create a photo documentary. You could make a film. So all of these ways of learning from, I think, these tools, and I would love to see a studio that would really engage in that actively. And maybe part of the design process is to design your way to knowledge. Like how are you going to know this place? And so maybe you take a whole group of students, you've done some, I think it would be interesting to compare the existing literature that's available to learn about that site, and even using things like, through what's available through the internet. What are the kind of things we have access to? When we look up the word Masula, what images populate the screen immediately? And how limited is that set? Like, are there thousands of images, or are there only 10 that repeat? So that will already tell us something about where we might need to do work. And I'm thinking actually of a text that was written by Alejandro Zarapolo, I believe in 1998. It was called A World Full of Holes for El Croquis. And he was talking about the idea of creating a map of architectural practices and looking at, similar to what Charles Jenks did in terms of the mapping of kind of constellation of architectural practices. But Zarapolo talked about looking for kind of openings or gaps, like where are the holes in that map? Where have things not been something has not been placed there in the discussion. And I think that that kind of field work, to my mind, that would be a very rich and empowering experience for a studio to actually begin to learn about how do we construct our means of knowing something, and that in and of itself is part of the design process. Then the part two of that would be the application, because I think we can always think of in different fields, like applied and theoretical physics, for example, what is the application of that knowledge? And I think you've demonstrated an example of how you've tested that out in terms of applying some of these ideas about shared space, using the concept of al-masha, and saying what would happen if we translated that to a contemporary project on a different site. So that site is now in Los Angeles, but rather than kind of exporting images of the source material directly and kind of placing that onto a site, I think what you're trying to do is to sort of learn from that example of al-masha, which is a fascinating concept to me, because as you've described it, the idea of temporary ownership is enacted when there is something occurring on that site. So if the site is dormant and those activities aren't occurring, that kind of construct of ownership transforms. And so when the activation of the space is occurring, that's when we see this temporary ownership model
Exactly.
sort of being embodied. And I think that that is such a powerful provocation also for architecture, because often we think of architecture as something, we maybe think of the buildings that we design, the way they're placed in a space. But I think what you're speaking about has to do a lot with the activities, and it really pushes back on that word program that we use so often in architecture. Also, often thought of as maybe a listing of activities, but then how can program adapt, like something you might not be able to name it because it might be transforming over a yearly cycle, or it might be transforming over the course of 24 hours in your model of implementing al-masha. And so I think that these are two central parts of the pedagogical model that I would, in the future, I would love to see more work done on, by you and others, to really begin to examine that, like both how do we find our ways to knowledge, and then and what are the tools we use, what are the instruments, the mediums that we select for that, and acknowledging that each one of those will have certain limitations. Each one will also carry with it certain biases. And so to sort of acknowledge that, understand that, and then see what do those ways to knowledge reveal, and then both how do I apply that knowledge to, in this case, a design process in an architectural studio.
Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah. Marceline, I believe that in order to teach architecture in the provost system, this provost system, we need teachers who are eager to learn, teachers who not only seek to transfer their knowledge to a student, but also participate with the student in the process of learning new knowledge from new cultures. There's no repetitive fixed pattern in this system. I mean, thus the teacher and the student will both step into the realm of the unknown to learn new worldview, new method of analysis, and new way of solving problems. And eventually, both human beings will be masters of new mental and practical abilities that will combine their personal practice with acquired skills to achieve their goals. What do you think about the role of learning from others in developing a student's design abilities?
So I think when you say learning from others, you mean so both in the student group as well as outside of the student group. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Because I do think that there is a huge role that's played by again, going back to the idea of the learning community from Bell Hooks, that
Yeah.
In a studio model, which we have in architecture in many schools, the students observing how other students are working, what they're producing, how the work is responded to by a teacher, by a critic, that is one form also of learning from, because suddenly working side by side and seeing something that in one's own work, maybe someone responded to in a certain way and responded differently to another student's work, and really being able to see the difference. I think that is one example of learning from. And then I think in your model, you're applying that to really outside of the classroom, outside of the school, saying, how do we, if we're sitting in one location in the world and we have access to certain information about another place, another culture, that this act of learning from, I think, is, it often does present some difficulties as well, in terms of like the practicality of the fieldwork model might necessitate that the studio is maybe, rather than running for one semester, maybe it's a longer studio where there's a seminar and a studio component. So there's time to travel, to do the field work, to come back to really sort through that material. And I think that whole act constitutes what you're calling learning from. So I think it's really a very important contribution to the discussion on pedagogy that you're making there.
Thank you. And as a final point, as I mentioned earlier, in order to learn from others, we need to give up power and be humble in front of others. Otherwise, we may misunderstand learning. We are not going to define others. They do it well with their own language and their own style. Our job is to open our eyes and our ears to see and hear new sounds and new colors from others. We need to accept others as others. As I mentioned, I said, not words like firing a line or even something like third word. This is more than just architecture education. At least for me, it's more than this. I see it is a moral duty and serious change in the educational system. Would you please evaluate the exactly this idea, the idea of learning from instead of learning about or discovering others.
So yes, I would agree with you that this extends beyond the architectural education and maybe is relevant to many fields, relevant to how we think about the academy, how sort of education is currently structured. I think large questions exist between the learning from model and then the idea of expertise, because that's something I would not want to discount either, is that the expertise, that what is defined as expertise in a certain area is also kind of related to that cultural construct of, you know, what makes someone an expert in a certain field. And so I think understanding how that level, that idea of expertise is different, maybe in different contexts. So if we go to an architecture faculty in Iran and interview and talk to faculty members and students there, the construct of expertise may include, there may be you know, a broader definition or a narrower one of certain areas of our disciplinary knowledge, but then there are certain shared areas maybe that we could travel to many different contexts and look at how the discipline of architecture is sort of constructed, and what do we care about maintaining, what do we care about imparting to the next generation. So I think that is also a project that one could undertake, is to really see the difference in maybe how certain subjects are taught in different faculties around the world, and looking at how that, you know, something I think you've pointed out as well that's important is the distinction between saying history theory maybe is contained in the sort of structure of a seminar. That seminar might meet once a week, whereas a design studio is sort of defined within the structure of studio culture. So it's a kind of recurring 3 times a week for, you know, 4 hours per time, that it's a lot more time that one's spending in that studio culture. And the way in which the rhythm of the seminar occurs weekly, one could question that too. Maybe there's an idea that comes out of your pedagogical model that could say, you know, the seminar, we have a more immersive, you know, the seminar for 3 weeks, we're going to immerse ourselves in this particular history theory seminar. And studio will kind of be a little bit lighter in those weeks. And then after 3 weeks, we focus more on studio and we try to implement some of the things we're learning. I mean, I also think that it's not always a direct, I think it would be very difficult to say that, you know, one is doing research, kind of proposing and writing, and then directly applying. I think there are moments of application that might occur, but across the curriculum. And it might be much later that something one has studied in their first semester in a history theory course may end up informing something they do in their graduate thesis project. So I would never want to see those as sort of discreetly you know, tied to one another in the sort of compartment of a year, but I would want to see that kind of exchange occurring across in a sort of non-lateral way, but something that maybe jumps across the curriculum in time. And so I think I find it's been very inspiring to hear from you today about this pedagogical model and about your thoughts on learning from instead of learning about. And it's really, to my mind, brought onto the table for all of us as educators, as students, as researchers, many important points. And it's really inspired me to think about, you know, how some of this could begin to enter the architecture curriculum. So I'd like to thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your points and all of your opinions. I really appreciate your time and for being here today. Thank you so much. And thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for such thoughtful presentations and a great discussion. This is such a timely topic, and it's I think you've made a nice contribution to it, Reza, and opened up some really great questions moving forward about the designer's relationship to the people they design for, and what that might mean for how we construct, you know, the future of architecture education and the canon, really, if there is still one. So thanks a lot. We're going to take a quick break here before our next panel. Thank you for tuning in today. We'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. Welcome back to the DTP Show. This is a production of the students of the SCI-Arc Design Theory and Pedagogy class 2021. Today, we're hearing from students and their invited guests on topics both central and tangential to their research and pedagogies. Our next discussion will expand on the idea of roughening the surface, or in Russian, ostranaya, which is probably best translated to defamiliarize. This literary technique was developed by the Russian formalists at the OPAJAZ in St. Petersburg, in particular Viktor Shklovsky and Boris Eichenbaum. Now, the goal of ostranaya is to challenge the human tendency to immediately recognize, understand, or automatically perceive something without thinking of it. For the next hour, SCI-Arc student Carlos Sirkin and Mark Foster Gage will discuss this technique of roughening the surface as it applies to architecture. Mark Foster Gage is an associate professor at the Yale School of Architecture, where he has taught and conducted architectural research continuously since 2001. His firm combines theoretical speculations with the use of emerging technologies and materials. We are very excited to have Mark here today because he has been one of the most vocal provocateurs supporting the pursuit of aesthetics in architecture. He's edited and authored many important books dealing with different aspects of aesthetics, including aesthetic theory, design and social equality, and aesthetics equals politics. Thank you for being here today, Mark.
My pleasure.
Carlos Sirkin is a student in the design theory and pedagogy at SCI-Arc. Before joining the program, he was practicing and teaching architecture since 2015, with many works exhibited in galleries in San Francisco. He is currently a co-editor of Off-Ramp issue number 18, and for the past year, his work has obsessed over techniques of defamiliarization and questions of aesthetics. Carlo has prepared a series of talking points today with which to get our conversation started. So without further ado, Carlo, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here today. I'm really glad you're able to make it. There are two aspects of formalism that I kind of wanted to address today in the next hour. The aesthetics of formalism and the politics of formalism. These are two topics which obviously you're very familiar with, but I think we're going to confront them today with from a slightly different angle. Let's first talk about the aesthetics of formalism. Now, this is something that you, in your practice and your teaching, have been addressing for what, like 15, 20 years now. I've been addressing it for a much shorter time. But I would say that you address the act of defamiliarization by engaging questions of aesthetics head on. It seems to me, anyways, that you're very much interested in delaying the viewer's understanding of a thing, kind of roughening the surface, if you will. It seems to me that you're also concerned with the effects that make the onlooker pause and question what's going on. For example, the drawings from your Geothermal Futures Lab exhibition at SCI-Arc, already in the title, there's a kind of slowing down effect. It's a weird sequence of words. But in those drawings, they look like any other kind of incomprehensible isometric mechanical drawing, but in fact, embedded in those drawings are things, let's say, not so mechanical. For example, a hamburger. I'll just show an image of one, right? So anyways, so I have to assume that for you, it's much bigger than simply finding Easter eggs in drawings, right? On some level, those who engage in an architecture of formalism are trying to slow down the reading of a project, even make the onlooker pause. So let me ask you, what do you think it actually means to slow down the reading of a project?
Okay. Without addressing the subject of formalism, you know, I can talk about estrangement. I think maybe we need to lay a kind of foundation for formalism first, though. So I think the term is kind of like confusing in how it's applied today. And I just wonder how you think of the term formalism and what it means. And then I'll answer what I think it means.
I guess I like to take the formalist all the way kind of further back, starting with like the Russian literary formalist. So it was their kind of attitude to use, let's say, for example, sound as a dominant device, something that was independent of the story and the meaning and the narrative of the piece. And for example, just sound could be pulled out of the project or out of the written work. and used in a way to kind of slow down the reader so that the reader would start to like pay more attention to the words or that very particular word. Sometimes it was used as a rhetorical device to that used almost a kind of poetic cadence in the reading.
Yeah, just to clarify, like that's I would say a good definition of formalism in that context. Although that idea of engaging, let's say, an artistic experience in a way that's separate from concepts and narratives, or that doesn't fit concepts and narratives, really comes from Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle really introduced the word form into the world, but also believed in Eudemian ethics that it is possible to experience things with your senses and not with your mind. So that's like a very early, so all of the ideas, your example with the early Russian literature and the sound experience, and my example with the abstract expressionism, are all kind of playing with this separation between how we experience the world through the senses and how we experience the world through concepts. And formalism is one of the extremes that says you can only, an extreme formalism would say you can only experience the world through sensual properties, not concepts, which I don't believe in, and I don't think you believe in, right? We believe in concepts like love or symbols or whatever. And then someone like Berkeley, who was one of the kind of followers of Descartes, believed that there couldn't possibly be an external reality. It all had to happen in the mind, which is a kind of more extreme version of Descartes. So in that formalism versus, let's say, I don't know if we can call it conceptualism or idealism, there's a big range, right? So Kant falls here, Hume falls over here. And so people aren't either like formalist or not formalist. It's just how much you believe formalism has an impact on how we understand reality versus how much importance you give to concepts in how we understand reality. So that tension is what estrangement banks on, right? Because it's constantly challenging your idea of reality because you're recognizing things and not connecting them with concepts.
I wonder if you're touching on maybe another aspect of formalism that is the experience, like an experience. Are there experiential qualities of formalism?
Well,
I'm wondering.
A formalist would say there's only experiential qualities of that I use this example a lot, so you may have heard it before in my SCI-Arc lectures, but you pick up a vase and you make an aesthetic judgment on that vase before you recognize it as a vase, before you recognize the word vase, before you recognize it's blue, before you recognize it has a shape like a Coke bottle, before you recognize it has a function that's supposed to hold water. So this is really important, that this is Kant's introduction of basically the entire discourse of aesthetics. He says that no, humans have a relationship with that object, whatever it is, before they understand what it is and its function. And that's the beginning of aesthetic discourse. Like, he literally founded aesthetic discourse.
That's, I guess, where also the Russian formalists would also distinguish themselves from like Saussure semiotics, right? Where it was all about
Totally.
kind of meaning of something.
Yeah,
kind of
Saussure introduced, when I
of.
said like Saussure introduced was kind of a very, very early structuralist, which dominated the 20th century and therefore your and my educations. But he basically said, when you look at a vase, you see something. When you recognize it as a vase and use the word vase, then it becomes, in a sense, at the actual reality that we in a sense think through language, and all of our ideas have to come from language, that you can only think verbally, in a sense. Some of them went so far as to say.
Mm-hmm. Let me pull up two images really quick. I have two images. I'm wondering what the experience is in the image, and actually, if we look at these images as images themselves. These are the images of projects. This one's your project, right? The house on Ile-Rennes-Levasseur. If we look at it, there's elements of architecture, fenestration, which is letting light in, but it's also letting the viewer see outside. There are elements of kind of material choices that look like perhaps they were supposed to be meant outside, but now they're inside. There's a garden on the inside. There's a pool on the inside. So in a way, it's almost it questions what's inside and what's outside. It's almost an inversion of outside in. In a way, the inhabitant is inhabiting outside environments on the inside. This is another. This is say an image from a project of mine. If I can get to it.
I like it. You're putting us on equal footing. I like a bravery.
Well, the rendering is not nearly as good, but it still has elements of strange material choices, I would say, unusual tectonics. There is a kind of question of what's inside and what's outside, right? If we question this thing just from a kind of formalist experience, what do you think these images are doing? And they're images, right? Because they're not built, or we're not standing in them. They're just they're in a way a representation of another world, but in a way they are also a world in and of themselves.
Well, that shouldn't matter, because you would have your aesthetic judgment of these before you recognize they were images or in real life.
How would you, okay, that's really, how would you already have an aesthetic judgment of it? What would your aesthetic judgment of it be?
Well, this is one tricky aspect of Kant. The word judgment implies a kind of answer, like a kind of like, the way he means it might be more of like a understanding, like an aesthetic understanding. Before I realize it's a building, that like a pure formalist, I'm just going to take an extreme position for the sake of clarity, would look at an image of your or my work, and they can determine that it's spatial. There's perspective and people, that they wouldn't maybe label people, but they're essentially just looking at like colors and relationships of shapes and forms. It's like almost like the nervous system, which is what painter Francis Bacon said. He wanted his paintings to operate on the nervous system, and that's a good way to think of like a pure aesthetic formalism, which just says your aesthetic relationship to the images that you just put up is all contingent on their shapes and colors and arrangements of forms and readings of space and depth, but you haven't yet applied any terms to it. You haven't even applied the term building or human or structure. So the estrangement really happens like after you start to, estrangement happens after aesthetics. I mean, if you would take a really hard like Kantian position.
It's a thing you think about after you've digested what
Right.
I would, as you know,
I mean, essentially an aesthetic judgment is like whether you like, I mean, this is too extreme to say, but it's one way that's good for conversation is to say you make a decision whether you like the look of something or not. And you don't need to, the human eye doesn't need, I guess that would be the judgment, like whether it's pleasing to your eye or not, right? So you probably have this experience all the time when you're walking through, I don't know, walking down well, there's no sidewalks in Los Angeles. So you're driving down the freeway and seeing other people in cars, you turn and look at certain people because they catch your eye in a certain way, right? The cliche of literally like walking down the sidewalk and turning your eye and looking at someone that has aesthetic qualities that appeal to you, that you like, forces you to stare. And this is what Elaine Scarry says, that's what forces people to draw and forces people to take photos of certain areas, that they're trying to capture a positive aesthetic experience that she calls beauty, but you don't have to call it beauty. But if you're standing on the on the beach in front of a sunset, I don't know anyone that's taken their camera and taken a picture of their feet. You're in the same location. You're at the same time. It's the same time of day. There's the same lighting conditions. Why do you take a picture of the sun instead of your feet? Because it has far more interesting and engaging spatial, aesthetic, and visual properties than your feet do at that moment. So you can gain pleasure from certain aesthetic and spatial relationships before you necessarily apply concepts to them.
I wonder if the aesthetic, let's say the Kantian aesthetic judgment or the analysis of something, analyzing or evaluating its aesthetics. I wonder if that's empowering the viewer, because there are kind of two aspects to the formalism, right? There's the technique. If we were to go embrace, let's say, Eichenbaum, and he kind of tried to introduce this kind of scientific technique to literature, which maybe is very pedantic, but nonetheless very crucial for him in a way to kind of create a formal method, as you might call it. The technique is something for the designer, like the creator, to use to get through the design. It's like the design process, right? But the judgment of aesthetics comes in kind of, it's like a tool for the viewer to then evaluate the thing that was produced, right? It's kind of interesting that maybe the aesthetic evaluation is the tool or the technique for the viewer to almost, in a way, own that thing, whether it's an image or it's another project or whatever it is.
That's it. It's like you just read my book, Designing Social Equalities. Like that's it. I mean, that's one of the big ideas in aesthetics, especially is how it relates. One of the ways it relates to politics in the book I did with Matt, that everybody is equally endowed with the ability to understand things in aesthetic registers. Not everybody is equal in their ability to understand things in conceptual registers, because understanding things conceptually often requires education, often, but not always. So the building I pick on the most is the transit center down at the World Trade Center, which Santiago Calatrava designed to look like a bird being released from the hands of a child, which is why it has those big wing things, you know? So you only know that if you have an education in architecture, right? Or you've read something about it. And that's kind of an elitist proposition to say you don't understand the true reality of the building until you've gotten its concept. And that makes the architect into this like uber person that applies meaning to buildings, and everyone else needs to understand the buildings through that narrative. That buildings are attached to narratives, and if like a bird, and if you don't understand the narrative, you don't understand the reality of the building. Whereas aesthetics says there's a way to engage with the building that doesn't yet even require concepts and therefore education. So it's an equalizing way of understanding aspects of the world. Make sense?
Yeah, I think so. You mentioned, I think we started to kind of venture towards maybe a political stance. And I think that's another important topic for us to discuss. Maybe we can transition into the politics of formalism for just a second. I think you know, the Formalist project is a little unpopular right now, right? I think in academic settings.
Yeah, you wrote that in your email, and I was curious
Yeah.
because that implies that people are no longer judging their work aesthetically. And I think architecture designers, even if they have no interest in formalism, are still making decisions aesthetically. They just don't talk about them in their reviews.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a point to separate the aesthetics on one side and
I mean, the
and the
trend
politics on
in
the other
architecture schools now is to say, I did this research, I did this analysis with traffic patterns and sun angles, and I deconstructed a novel by Kafka, and you know, like just anything, and that basically says, and that's what produced the building. So I didn't do anything. Like, don't blame me. It was the process and the research, and then the critics talk about how well you translated the research into the project. You know, so it's a kind of alibi that says, like, it was just the research and the mapping. Don't blame me for it, right? It's a really smart student strategy because it takes you out of the, you know, quote unquote firing line of criticism, and it takes architects out of the firing line of criticism. If an architect says, you know, like a Bjarke Ingros building always has a little diagram which defines the building, right? Which makes people understand it. Like you lift up a corner of the building to get more sunlight in it, and he's super talented and clear about making these little diagrams. But your understanding of the building is then contingent on that diagram. If you don't understand the diagram, you can't possibly understand the building, which means he doesn't want you to engage the building aesthetically. He wants you to engage it conceptually through the idea shown in the diagram. And you can see this in maybe like the kind of pyramid-y building he did on the west side in New York. Like, it's a really great concept. Like, you know, I love that little courtyard building, and he pulled up a side, and that's what gave him that big shape, and that's very clear, but he wasn't thinking about it aesthetically. So the reason we have walls and roofs in architecture is because roofs shed water. And if you make a wall into a roof, you end up with a giant surface that collects dirt. And if you paint it white, it looks even dirtier. So whenever you drive that building, by that building now, it's like completely filthy and kind of rotten looking, because maybe no thought was given to things like patina or age or its aesthetic properties over time. So really, really strong concept, making a really, really, I would say, problematic building. I wouldn't say it's a bad building, it's a fine building, but really problematic aesthetics, because it requires more maintenance, requires more cleaning. You know, it's just kind of an eyesore in certain areas where you can see it, when it was intended to be this big, beautiful concept. In reality, its aesthetic properties are nowhere near as strong as its conceptual properties. And my big position is that in architecture, we place conceptual properties here and aesthetic properties here in value. So we never talk about these. We always talk about these. And all I want architects to do is maybe like that, or maybe that. I'm not saying we need to do this. Everything should just be beautiful and aesthetic, and we shouldn't have concepts, and we shouldn't have intellection, and we shouldn't have function. Like, that's an absurd position. I just think architects need to develop a language that allows them to discuss aesthetic properties. We have a philosophical language in architecture for discussing post-structuralism or structuralism, which both emerge from linguistics. So we know we can talk about architecture in deeply and difficult philosophical terms, and we have the language for that. Anyone who's a critic who's ever mentioned Deleuze or Derrida or Guattari or Saussure has the faculties to link architecture to philosophical ideas. We don't have any vocabulary to link architecture to aesthetic ideas.
You mentioned something about the patina, right? Like, that's a material choice. It's perhaps like during the Hadoop time, material would not have been a question of formalism. Like, you know, the white models were supposed to be absent of any kind of environmental influence, material influence. It was just all about the kind of shape and position of things. But, you know, is that a process of, or a product of the tools and techniques that we're using today different from, let's say, Hadoop's time, which we're using, say, white cardboard paper to make models? Like, today, let me pull two more images really fast. Today we use like rendering softwares, right? And within the rendering softwares, there's these are two projects. Within the rendering softwares, it's really easy to kind of find materials that readily available, and if we can't find them, we can make them really easy, right? But now we're talking about now we've introduced material into the question of aesthetics, or into the decision-making process of formalism. And I wonder if that's simply a product of the software that we're using, or is that now actually a concern with people who are considering the aesthetic effects of a building? And I would say that it is. I would say the materials are now another layer of formal decision making, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the early modernists were looking to but really engage a kind of purity of form, which is almost Platonic, you know, these higher ideals of form and proportion. You know, for all the discourse about rationality and function and industry, you know, Le Corbusier was a mystic. You know, the guy had the modulor with these mystical proportions, and, You know, it's very strange that you say the sign of the times, the zeitgeist of the times is to engage with industry and, you know, equality, which produce international style, and then also say, but it's based on these magical proportions, which are a leftover from, you know, Renaissance ideas about how to make your buildings more divine. Basically, the golden section, people in the Renaissance realized that the golden section was what God used to make certain spirals. And if God used it, then we should use it, right? So why is Le Corbusier using it still? You know, it's a confusing moment. So there is that effort to have like pristine purity, right? And that was new in humanity. Like humans had really never seen a perfectly flat white surface before. You know, it's very difficult in architecture to put a perfectly flat white surface like the drywall you have behind you. You know, 150 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible, or possible only for very, very, very few people. So that was an innovation in technology that allowed them to have different formal ambitions. And those formal ambitions were to remove any evidence of aesthetic qualities. You remove color, you remove texture, you have a pure surface a pure surface of whatever material, metal, which connects to a pure surface of glass, and a joint which very clearly demonstrates how these two things are separate. Like you want the materials to be separate and you want their properties to be separate. That was a formal idea, right? There's also a conceptual idea, but it also gave modernism its look. If you look at something like the Barcelona Pavilion. Today, I think you're right that architects historically have only had access to shape, like really, really high degree of control of shape down to a certain scale. And there was no way to study material effects 500 years ago. You know, you could do a watercolor of a building or you could do a model of a building, but you couldn't study what your building might look like in stone. You know, you couldn't print out a stone texture and put it on your model. You couldn't watercolor a baby stone texture and put it on your model. And that wasn't even thought of being within the realm of architects' jobs. You know, architects were intended to produce what Alberti calls the lineaments, basically the lines that form later follows, that material later follows. Alberti never used the word form. He always used the word lineaments because architects produce this cage, and then, you know, contractors and laborers and masons fill that cage with material. Now, I think you're right that access to things like rendering software, but also textural software like ZBrush or Mudbox has given architecture access to textures. Never before in human history have architects had the ability to design textures down to the microscopic scale. And now they can, you know, with Mudbox or something. You can design the face of your building to look like rhinoceros skin that's pink, you know, that you have a realm of possibilities of not only how to make these things with new materials, but how to study them through representation and rendering. So I would say yes, whereas materials and textures specifically were not part of architecture's formal ambitions historically, they are now because technologies have allowed them to be now.
I have a personal question about your Guggenheim project. I've heard you once say that you never had intended to build it. It was a project to kind of see what you could do with like kit bashing, as you call it, right? You know, why wouldn't you want it to be built? In the sense that I guess the question is the image for you just as important as the building, or you know, let's just, for example, let's say that it was there's a cost-effective way of actually producing the building in real life, and you were able to kind of access this, and somebody wanted to do it. You know, why wouldn't you want to just put it out there, right? It's kind of, I think I've also seen in another one of your lectures.
Well, my answer is pretty simple. It's because it doesn't have the aesthetic properties that I would want it to have were it to be built. So I don't think it's a good building in aesthetic terms. I think it's a great building in philosophical and conceptual terms, but I was very clear in putting it out there that we didn't even submit it to the actual competition. It just got picked up by the press. as part of it all, but it was a philosophical experiment that had to do in 2014 with a lot of ideas about object-oriented ontology and a reaction against an overemphasis on interconnection and correlationism, which is kind of separate to this discussion. But yeah, that project was, I wanted to test out these new ideas from philosophy that I had in my head. And I was testing them out by writing, but I also wanted to test them out from architecture. And it's like Brunelleschi's Pazzi Chapel from 1421 is a terrible classical building, but it's his first. It's the first building of the Renaissance, one might say, right? It's the first time he tries to use Roman arches and classical pilasters and columns, the language of classicism, which he had spent studying in Rome about a decade, 2 decades earlier with his friend Donatello, not the Ninja Turtle. But the point is that Brunelleschi was introduced to these early ideas of the Renaissance that started with Petrarch, really 13th century, 14th century Italian poet. And the first building out of the gate for the Renaissance was pretty bad building. It's a bad building. I mean, architectural historians are going to like crucify me for saying that. But over 250 years of development of that classical and Renaissance tradition, you get things like Borromini and Guarini and some of, I think, you know, are the most sophisticated and great architectural projects in history. So I did that project knowing that I was going to fumble my way through it. And the only reason I used objects is because we wanted to build a building with projects that had no relationship to one another. You know, that they weren't all the same size or they didn't clip into one another. They weren't parametric. It's not when you lift, you know, enlarged one that one, if you enlarge one panel, a panel 100 panels away needs to twist, you know, that they didn't have any relationships to one another. So the way I thought about doing that, just as a kind of philosophical exercise, is, all right, we need to find a bunch of objects that have no relation and assemble them in a way that have no relation. So we didn't assemble them in like a narrative. I could have assembled it from, you know, natural objects to man-made objects and called it, you know, the evolution of human intelligence or something, you know, or I could have, you know, done curvy forms to straight forms. But we just slammed a bunch of objects together in a kind of weird cantilevered shape that just kind of popped out of some of our research and put it out there in the world. But yeah, that building doesn't have, it's weird, right? I know it's attention getting, I know it's weird. It was really fruitful in providing us with a new direction for architecture, which was later used, I would say, in much more controlled way with projects like our tower on West 57th Street or Museum of Art in Lima, Peru, or, you know, there's a number of projects which were derivative of that one in that the way they used separate components, but tried to resynthesize them into larger wholes. But that project I don't really find particularly pleasing to look at, which is why I say I wouldn't want it to be built.
So it's
well, I mean, sure, I'd want it to be built as a provocation and an idea. It'd be really great, you know, for the world. But my point is doing that building is I don't think the world should look like that. You know, it's like Peter Eisenman didn't renovate his own apartment, right? Because he don't want to live in his own work. Like he said, barbers don't cut their own hair. That was his excuse. But, you know, all architectural projects aren't a statement that says the entire world needs to look like this. And sometimes people think it is. Sometimes people think like, oh, you're the most dangerous architect. You're trying to make architect into sculpture. And I'm like, no, it was just an experiment. You know, I don't have any ambitions to change architecture to look like a bunch of stacked up, you know, toys and pigs and toasters. And I think that's an important thing, is that architects who engage with philosophy, as you do, are doing experiments. Like, we're not saying that, like modernism, there's no manifesto behind the Helsinki Guggenheim in the same way there would be behind the Barcelona Pavilion, which was also a provocation in its own right. But that provocation was a provocation that the whole world should be built this way. I don't have that provocation.
I think when everything starts to get built in a certain way, that then it starts to become a style, right? It starts to become almost something repeated, for the
Yeah.
sake of repetition. And
Yeah, and it's hilarious to me that people think that like we're over the idea of style. You know, Susan Sontag famously said in Against Interpretation that it's impossible to design or create anything that's not in a style. You know, like even doing a
Do you agree
white
with
cube, yeah, of course, even doing like a white cube is in a style, or doing analysis and then doing a building is going to result in a certain style. Every single student at SCI-Arc putting their project on a pink background is participating in a certain style. So that doesn't mean that like you're trying to do it. As a matter of fact, like the philosopher and historian Herder, the German romantic philosopher who was really instrumental in saying, you actually don't have any decision at all over what you create as an architect or an artist. History is determining what you're going to produce. So history is giving you the tools, innovation, you know, it's giving you the materials you're allowed to use. It's giving you the forms you have access to. It's giving you the opportunities to have to build. So you don't have a lot of free will in what you design as a building. You only have what history has provided with you as the spirit of the time in which you're in. Right? I mean, I don't personally believe in that, but yeah, that's like the idea that you can't help but build in a style, either because Herder is blaming it on history that everyone in the 21st century is doing work that's somehow related, or it's more regional, and you start to notice that every skyscraper is looking the same because they've developed a new type of glass which doesn't do what they call oil canning, which looks sort of rippled. So that's why all of the skyscrapers that are built recently have like this perfectly flat glass that doesn't oil pan, right? It doesn't give you the oil can effect. That's why all of Hudson Yards looks so like inert. It's just like all this perfect glass. And I don't think those architects all got together and were like, we should do a particular style. You know, they'd be horrified if people thought that. But through just the trends in building skyscrapers and the materials available, the software is available, the kind of functional expectations, which are very, very specific for a skyscraper, the circulation limitations, they all ended up looking very much the same, you know.
perhaps even just the glass manufacturer available.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So everyone is working in a style. It doesn't have to be called anything, but you're not ever going to do work that doesn't look like anything else out there, right? I think this whole rejection of the idea of style is pretty hilarious. You know, I don't think we need to go from postmodernism to deconstruction to digital formalism to object-oriented ontology. Like, I don't think we need to think architecture in these clear movements anymore. Maybe it's micro styles, right? Maybe it's like 4 people working on a certain thing, or 8 people over here. It's not like architecture in the 1930s was all modernism, you know. We don't have these grand master narratives about style anymore. We just have different people in different parts of the world doing micro styles, whether they know it or not. Doing work that's related, whether they know it or not.
I think there's still a tendency to categorize things, which I think is an issue, right? Like it's almost dumbing down the work into like one name, one category that ignores what's really going on there. It's ignoring all the nuances of the thought that was going into every detail.
No, you're totally right. I've written about this also, that the Enlightenment way of understanding, which was taking power away from God, like prior to the Renaissance, it was really God's job to understand reality, and humans had no business in the matter, right? As the Renaissance went through humanism, where knowledge was starting to be recentered in the human mind, as opposed to leaving it all in God's hands, we got the Enlightenment, right? Which was the kind of collision of science and philosophy, which says that man can know things, and man can develop this thing called scientific method, where he can verify that he knows things, even though science was really invented by Aristotle for all intents and purposes. But now the Enlightenment says that humans are responsible for their understanding of reality, which was such a huge thing. But so this is good, right? We think the Enlightenment is good. But as with everything, there are good things and bad things. And one of the bad things, in my opinion, about the Enlightenment in general is that it introduced the idea of taxonomy into epistemology, which just means what you said, that it made knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge dependent on its slotting into categories, right? So Darwin goes and discovers things, and you get mammals and birds and genus and phylum, and everything is like categorized, right? So, you know, whatever, however it goes, genus, phylum, family, blah, 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 species, you know, that's a categorization, or there's a categorization of artistic types. This is Impressionism. This is abstract expressionism. This is, and that's how you understand things. And that's one of my biggest, let's say, one of my greatest sadnesses is that we still look at the world through categories as an after effect of the Enlightenment. So you go into the MoMA and you look at Monet's water lilies, and you just kind of like walk by because you've seen a lot of other Impressionist paintings. And you're like, oh, that's Impressionist. It's, I know I'm not supposed to like it. It's kind of cheesy. Like, I don't want anyone to see me looking at Monet, and you kind of walk through it. But what that takes away from us is the ability to look at individual things, right? Because we just plump them into categories. Same as with people, like this person's black, this person's white, this person's, we're not actually looking at the aesthetic qualities of people. We're looking at one aspect of their cultural heritage that allows us to put them in a category, you know? When you look at a person and put them in a category, you're not like, well, I put all people who have a pupil larger than a 1/4 inch in one category, and everyone with a pupil a smaller inch in a different category. It's always based on skin color, because we're programmed to think of things in categories. And Kant actually says that's part of the human condition. He says sometimes it's impossible for humans to think of things not as being in categories. So Kant says when you think of an object, you have to think of it as in one of 3 categories. They are that it is an individual object, that it is one of many objects, or that it is all objects. It's impossible for the human mind to think of an object outside one of those 3 categories. So he's actually saying that Enlightenment quality of categorization is innate to humankind. I haven't given the issue much thought, whether it's like innate or kind of learned via the Enlightenment. All I know is that it's hugely problematic because we no longer look at things individually for their aesthetic qualities. We look at them categorically for their taxonometric qualities or their style relationship qualities. They're concepts.
The concepts, yeah. Maybe that's the argument for a kind of formal method, because embedded within that formal method is the is basically a rule, or unwritten rule, but it's a rule that the moment that you recognize something, or you know, maybe now we could even modify that and say the moment that you can categorize something, or give it a style, or give it a name, is the moment that that thing it needs to be rethought.
That's, you just described like, I would say the most important part of Kant's critique of judgment, which is his third book. I mean, he dedicated his life to 3 books, one on basically one on reason, one on ethics, and one on aesthetics. And the aesthetics one had never existed before, but he basically is saying what you just said, among other things. But so congratulations, you're thinking on par with Kant. That's pretty good.
Well, I guess then maybe the question is then how is it possible to break away from those kind of styles or categories? You know, the person who breaks away from the styles and categories now is kind of considered rogue, almost an outlier, right?
I don't think it's possible to break away. Like, I think styles are like haircuts. Like, has there been a haircut that you've never seen before, ever, that just completely blew your mind in the last year? How many times in your life do you see a haircut that's just so different from any other haircut? Like the times you probably, you know, there's probably not many examples because there's limitations on hair, its color, what you can do with it, how long it can get. Matt's, you know, trying some experiments with his, but there's limitations, and there's limitations with what you can do with a building. So I don't think it's possible for architects anymore. This is actually what Peter Eisenman wrote about in my monograph, if it's possible to estrange things anymore. And that's his question to me, is it's easy in a culture of modernism to do something outrageous, right? Because if everyone's doing wood box, white boxes or whatever, and you do, something with all crooked grids and stairs that lead nowhere, so there's no function, and like you're being like naughty, right? But in a world where everything is permissible, is it still possible to be naughty?
So if you're saying estrangement no longer exists, or ostraniany, right, no longer exists, then formalism no longer exists, right?
No, that's not true. I would just say it's harder to do estrangement than it has been in the past. And it requires architecture to move outside of the confines of what has historically been considered architecture. Like, I don't know if there's anything I could see on Instagram architecturally that would just totally surprise me. Like, I've never seen that before. Do you?
I guess
I think there's things that I would see and kind of feel like that's unusual, but I don't think it's possible to have like a totally rogue career anymore. No one cares what any individuals do anymore. There's like, in the 1980s when there was like 4 architecture magazines, and Michael Graves and Robert Amsterdam started doing, and Venturi started doing postmodernism, it like blew people's minds because there was like 20 architects in the world who got their stuff published every couple months in these various American magazines. Now there's, 80 million blogs and websites, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, with what David Erdman calls David Rue calls a debris field of images, that it's really hard to stand out among 80 million images. It's much easier to stand out among 80 images.
It'll be interesting how the historians document our time, like 20 years from now, looking back.
I don't know. The one
will
question is, will they be able to be? Like, I mean, history is largely kind of like coming up with master narratives for a particular era.
Right.
And our master narrative might be that there was no master narrative. Everyone was doing their own thing. Everyone was consuming as much as they could. Everyone was individualistic. There was no interest, at least in the United States, in community, or it was rugged individualism, this, or in the case of like Trump supporters, like this super nationalism that, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how historians write specifically about architecture 100 years from now. My guess is that it will probably be very unfavorable.
I bet you we'll all be put in a category, right?
Yeah, I think
the problem with this,
but it might just be, I mean, in truth, most of what's built has nothing to do with architects. And most of what architects do looks, more or less like kind of corporate boxes and stuff. Maybe some bamboo in there if you want to be sustainable, or, a couple crooked angles, or maybe a curved wall, or there's kind of a limited repertoire of what architects can do with the available products on the market, which is why I say that it's dangerous that architects are becoming what I call product pickers. Like, we don't design material effects, we pick products and hope they have the material effects we want. The reason that we pick products is it's very difficult to build a building without using products, because products are insured and they have warranties. And nobody wants to build a project with products that don't have warranties, right? So you can't just develop a new curtain wall with these really amazing aesthetic qualities. It would need to be tested by the government and insured and warranted, which prohibits a lot of architectural experimentation. So this is what Herder would say is what history has given us, our zeitgeist, where we're only allowed to pick products and drag and drop them onto boxes in BIM. And that's the extent of what our architecture can do right now. And I think my friends and I, who you're probably interviewing or know or have been taught by, are just really raging against this machine with everything we have, with the loudest work and the loudest voices, which is why, my work, and I would say Tom Wiscombe and Freda Colatin and Michael Young and a lot of other people, younger generation like Christy Ballier and Jimenez and team and a whole upcoming group of people are all doing work that is fighting so hard against that paradigm, against that zeitgeist of dragging and dropping warranted materials onto your BIM boxes that you've cleverly shuffled around to show program arrangements, you know, which is why all buildings that Kennedy Press now are like pixelated. Every building in New York that's going up right now, which is like a residence, is just like little pixels pushing back and forth. It's because it's like the most architecture you can do using products without changing the products. So that's why every, you know, half of the buildings by ODA are just like, you know, these like Kubert looking kind of pixels. And it's like, maybe that's our trend of the moment, pixelated buildings. Because that's all that's possible given the products you can drag and drop your warranted products into your BIM model for. But that's why our work is so loud. You know, that's why our work is not minimalist. That's why, you know, Hernandez Alonso exists and I exist, because for the past 20 years, as this tendency towards drag and dropping materials on BIM models, which erases architectural qualities and differences and homogenizes everything, which is why Dallas looks like Houston, looks like a suburb of Paris. We're like raging with that, with like volume 11 in Spinal Tap terms, because we don't know what else to do to get people to notice that we're losing architectural's cultural value.
That might be an interesting last point. Carlo, did you have any more specific things you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we can wrap it up. Maybe that's a good ending point, Mark. You know, basically ending on a provocation, not a question, but on the provocation that should really be considering what the formal method is, or what a formalist project is, in terms of technique, in terms of aesthetic evaluation.
It's funny, you and I still both, but you're thinking of formalism as a category. Right?
No, I take it out of the category, because the moment it becomes a category is like,
well, if you use the term formalism, it's in a category. I think we need to talk about individual buildings or objects without putting them in categories. So I would even prefer that we just throw up one of your projects and talk about it, then talk about like, is it formalism or not? Or what's the value of formalism?
Oh, I would also agree with that.
Yeah, I want to return like our attention to actually what we're doing and not the concepts and categories of what we're doing.
There's I would agree. Eliminate the categories, but
we kind of have to eliminate the word formalism though. Yeah.
We can eliminate that. Then it's all about technique and aesthetics, which neither of those are categories. They're in a way processes, right?
Provocations or processes. I mean,
process. Yeah.
Kant would say it's impossible to make rules that produce certain aesthetic effects, because aesthetic effects happen before the human mind conceives of things like rules, which is a kind of nice out, because he's basically saying like there's no rules that will produce beauty, you know, so you can have beauty, but there's no way to guarantee you're going to produce it, which is basically his reaction against things like the golden section. And he said, it's stupid. You can't produce rules that produce beauty.
Or Burke's directly against Burke's ideas of beauty, which were
Burke
very defined, right?
Yeah,
smooth curve, proportional ratio, transitions,
right,
coloration, but not too bold, right?
Right. Yeah.
No, anyways.
Well, it's been
Mark, this has been wonderful. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's been an amazing conversation. So good to hear both of your very cultured perspectives on this topic. Makes me
I look forward to more discussions. It's been good. It's been fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the DTP Show. Thanks for joining us today. This is a production of the students of the SCI-Arc Design Theory and Pedagogy class of 2021. Today, we're hearing from students and their invited guests on topics both central and tangential to their research and pedagogies. Previously, we talked about the technique of roughening the surface. Now we will talk about technique and how it changes the way we think and talk. More specifically, I'm speaking about virtual reality. VR has always been used in post-production of architecture due to its ability to immerse the user in content such as VR walkthroughs and interactive architectural projects. It's a new way of showing, but it can become a gimmick when it simply adds extra steps to old ways of working. Designers may still be working in Rhino and importing their models into Unity or Unreal. However, our next guest will discuss with us a new way of working in VR at the beginning of the design workflow. Finian McManus is a creative director and concept artist working in film, AAA games, and TV. He is the founder of Terraform Studios and has worked on films and games such as the Avatar sequels, Marvel's Thor, Love, and Thunder, WandaVision, Disney's Jungle Cruise, and The Lion King, Star Wars Rogue One, Pacific Rim 2, and God of War. He is also famous for doing these concepts with VR modeling and specifically with Adobe Media. James Chen is a graduating student of the Design Theory and Pedagogy at SCI-Arc. He also has a Bachelor of Architecture from SCI-Arc, and his work now is primarily about how we model in VR, the techniques that come with it, and how to use it for architectural purposes. He also explores the cultural changes that have led to these modeling techniques being adopted and accepted generally by various constituents within the industry. He is also developing an architectural modeling game called Cube Saga with a Q that is releasing next year on January 10th on Steam. So now I'll turn it over to Phineas, and looking forward to this discussion.
Well, hi guys. Thank you, Matt and James, for inviting me. I'm honored, and I'm happy to share with you guys and the rest of the students some of my past work that I've done with VR, why I chose VR, you know, the few things about it that really make it powerful in my workflow and within the workflow of my studio, Terraform. So I'll kind of start and show you guys some slides here. So this was one of the first pieces I did for Disney's Jungle Cruise, which just recently came out in theaters. I mean, we started working on this movie many years ago, but VR was one of the main proponents to my work on the film. And I'll kind of go through why I really chose VR to work with and how I use it today, because that's changed over time. But really, at the end of the day, VR for me is a way of very quickly and rapidly ideating on interesting and natural design forms that you wouldn't normally be able to achieve within such short period of time. So I wanted to kind of show some of the initial designs I did. This is way back when I was a student, maybe even I would say 4 years ago. And this was one of the first designs I had done with VR. Ironically, I learned about VR while I was taking a vehicle design class. And this was one of the first explorations of blocking in a form. Now, back then, what I would do is I would illustrate thumbnails, which are a quick way to explore ideations in 2D. And then I would try to rough it in and really express what the forms are in a 3D space. So I kind of pictured it at the time like working with clay. In the end, my opinion of how it relates to our reality changed. But back in these days, I was really exploring how you can sculpt something with a physical form in 3D space. And I would use it for, you know, all sorts of designs. And essentially, I would sculpt those designs individually and then import them into a program like Maya or Max or Cinema 4D, which is what I was using, and assemble a scene around those models. This was kind of the first thumbnail page that I used for this vehicle design class. So it was very basic, just getting 2D shapes down, but having this as a guide as to how you might express these forms, it became very useful once you're inside the program. And I'll show some process for how I actually use these a little bit later on. This is another example of just blocking something in using that thumbnail sketch. This ended up being a dump truck that I created. You can also use it for designing and refining individual parts. So this was a wheel that I did with radial symmetry in that program. And then I would project that back into the model to create a final scene. And most of the models in this scene were made using Medium. It became, a process I was obsessed with. And I think beforehand I was using ZBrush and Cinema 4D to do these shapes, and it was taking a long time. I wasn't as used to building things on the fly, but I quickly realized that by using VR, and these are done with Gravity Sketch, another 3D program in VR, that you could create these quick shapes very, very easily and then build a scene with them. So what I usually like doing is essentially building a kit bash set for myself to use based off of a form language. So I would have an inspiration. I would use that inspiration to create a language for instance, a city or maybe spaceships or vehicles or even an interior space. And then I would build that out in VR and import it into a new program to kind of create a scene. Oftentimes with these, I'm thinking with a film point of view, if I'm creating keyframes that would be present in the final shot of a movie, and ultimately learning that process of how to create a film ready shot using these tools is what led me to use it in a production pipeline. These are from a class I taught at New Edge in Paris, design school in Paris, almost 2 years ago. It was about 1.5 years ago. And these were done in a combination of tools. So I would use Medium to sculpt them and then Gravity Sketch to do the props inside of them. So for these, I had a lot of inspiration from sea creatures and underwater plants. And it's very easy when you're inside the program to pull up these references and sculpt alongside them, thereby informing your work in a very detailed way. And the ease at which you can create these things, it's really quite fast. I mean, this model would maybe take me 20 minutes to make. And then just putting some texture over it very simply, I can import all this stuff into a scene and get a scene like this done, within a couple days. And most of the time, the thing that takes up the most amount of work is more the atmosphere, the color, the painting part of it, rather than the physical design of the elements. The design of the elements is actually the fastest part because it can be so efficient. And, I just really fell in love with the process. I started using it for everything. These were some pieces I designed for a piece Adobe commissioned me to do for the release of a newer version of Medium that they released earlier this year. And how I usually start is I like making these individual designs and objects as they relate to each other, and then assembling them into some sort of scene that I use a camera to pan around to find the perfect angle and to really start telling a story with these elements. Because in concept design, even though you have a lot of aspects to consider when it comes to architecture, when it comes to space and functionality, a lot of the time it's about telling a story and really immersing your viewers in something that they can relate to. I've also used it in more explorative projects, personal projects that aren't related to the industry. So these pieces were done for just kind of something I did on my spare time, just trying to test out some new techniques, some new lighting scenarios. And, I really took these moments to experiment with how I could use these tools. Do I create props to help that story tell better? Do I create plants? You can really go in and do anything. And a lot of these images, almost everything inside them is designed in VR. Now, I'm not saying that is the only tool I use in my workflow these days. There's a lot of other tools as well, but it quickly became a solution that was very fast for giving clients a turnaround when it came to designing architecture and plants and environment scenes. We even at my studio released kit batch packs. So we develop products that use VR as a base, and then would sell those products online to other digital artists to use in their workflows. So these are a part of a kit batch ruin pack that we made. Now, these aren't done by me. They're done by one of my employees, Alec, who works at the studio. But it became something that we kind of regularly integrated into a lot of our projects. And, you doesn't even have to be something that's very grand. It could be something that's a doorway, for instance. It can be something that's, quite detailed. And you can also use it to simulate lighting. So for this piece, I had taken a piece of Arabic script and tried to inspire a light pattern off of that script. And I had designed this kind of ceiling piece that had a lot of negative space in it to kind of simulate this lighting effect that's happening here. And then for a piece like this, the inspiration were Indian stepwells or baulis, which are ancient structures, some 2,000 years old, that are present all over India. And I used to go visit those with my mother when she was writing a book about India. And they were a big inspiration to developing, this kind of atmosphere and environment scene. So, throughout the years, I've really explored a lot of how I could put these into my process and really use them to tell a variety of stories, not just about architecture, but about different environmental scenes, science fiction, fantasy, but also some real world stuff. So I don't just use it for exploring original shapes, even though that's probably where I feel like it's the best. It can also be used for a lot of more real world applications. There's people I know that use VR modeling in the medical field. There's people I know that use it in architecture for interior design. I think that there's a lot of really great applications to it. But just like there's many great applications, it still does have some ways to go when it comes to, for instance, accurate measurements, when it comes to really getting down to the details like bevel and chamfers and things like that. But just from what I've seen about future technologies that are coming to the space, it really does have a bright future. And hopefully within the next 2 years, a lot of products will be released that kind of help shape the future of VR. Because I've seen a lot of really great stuff that's happening right now in the industry. And I'm very optimistic for how VR and AR technology will be developed for the use of designers in the future. And like I said, I think that its ultimate strengths lie in the fast ideation and exploring shapes that you wouldn't normally explore if you were working on a traditional modeling program. The main reason that I think contributes to that is the fact that you're using your hands to create a lot of these forms. So you can do very broad gestures, you can do sweeping motions, and it lets you give a lot of life and soul to the individual forms that you're creating. Whereas when I'm working on a 3D modeling program, you're clicking and dragging polygons, you're using algorithms if you're using Houdini. It can sometimes feel very digital and very stiff. And what I really like about VR is it allows you to expand and create some more dynamic shapes by using body gestural motions. Now, these are a couple pages of just general reference that I use when I think about design. So these aren't necessarily related to the past images I was showing, but I did want to show some of the inspiration that I collect. And this is just what I had in my folder over the past couple of days. So I really take inspiration for my environment work off of a lot of different things. It could be anything from a pattern found in nature and rocks and trees. It could be fine art. It could be different creatures. It could be ancient artifacts or modern day architecture as well. But I would say that, in my opinion, the best inspiration comes from natural elements rather than man-made elements. And that's not to say I don't use man-made inspiration, but I am very personally drawn to the natural patterns that happen in our world and how we can translate those into architecture and into design. And that's just something I've always been passionate about, but it always really excites me to see those patterns in nature. And to me, they just seem very original and unique. And it makes me want to find some way to incorporate that into a design. But at the end of the day, I take inspiration from all over the place. So it doesn't have to just be, patterns. It could be, an African headdress or a museum installation or some sort of construction work, or even up there like a digital pattern that is being created. These are all things that I think can help inform work and make it more original and interesting, because so often we see the same sort of images day to day, whether you're browsing on social media or going on a portfolio site or even looking at colleagues' work, you are taking in so many of the same imagery that sometimes you're subconsciously inspired to follow that. And what I try to do is inspire myself with things that are very different from what I might experience in my day-to-day life. And whether that's through traveling or from trying to put myself in a different space mentally where I'm just surrounding myself with these images, it's been something that has been very informative to my design process over the years. I did think that I would show, just a quick video of some of my process inside of Medium, because that might help. And this is very sped up, but nowadays, this was probably about a year ago that I created this video. And it mainly focuses on creating a piece of desert architecture, kind of like a fortress. And I really start with a line sketch now. So instead of jumping right into very large blocky shapes, I try to think about the form that I'm creating as a line drawing, like a rough sketch. If I were to draw on a napkin, this is what the VR version of that would be. So I try to plan out what the entrance is, what the archetypal shapes and forms are, what the functionality of it is, and how all the shapes relate to each other. And, then just start blocking in things with a very small brush. And what that helps me to do is kind of visualize what the end goal will be. And it lets me change things very rapidly on the fly without having to commit to something. So I'll skip ahead a little bit in the video. And this is where you see I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty happy with block in. And I start to place some elements down from different pieces that I've made in the past. So that was a piece of architecture that we sold in one of our packs at the studio. And then with a lot of tools in these programs, you can actually then manipulate that individual object using a move tool. And what that'll do is take that individual object and really expand it and drag it. So you'll see here that you can very quickly drag those forms out. And it's really fun when you're working inside these things. For me, it's much more interactive than a lot of 3D modeling packages. And I feel a lot more free when I'm exploring shapes. And it really does feel like I'm more connected to the design theory and methodology that I try to keep in mind when I can work on the fly like this. So it becomes a very fun process. It's almost like you're playing around in a way. Once you have the main forms established, I like to populate the scene using other pieces of architecture. So I play around with adding different secondary, tertiary elements, expanding the floor area. And at this point, I try to figure out where the camera will be. But I keep everything on separate layers, essentially, so that I can always rotate between them in the future. Then, even down to placing pottery, that's something that you can also make in VR and also place among your scene. So that's all, very fun to do. And, even destruction, here I'm going into the structure and giving it little chips and trying to show wear and tear, essentially, to the different pieces of stone that it's being made of. I think I probably have the final coming up here in a second. So this is when, I've gotten to kind of the end of the design and I'm really just adding the final touches to it. You can see that there's a lot of different elements there. And the reason I have it separated out into colors is that I can assign materials to it better when I'm going through it later in a design program. So that was the process for this image. And let's see if I can pull up this other one. So this was another video. Not sure if I can skip ahead on this. So in a similar way, this was a piece where I had made an environment beforehand. So you can see it in the back there. And I'm trying to design a piece of architecture that will fit inside of that environment. So the environment in the back is a 3D scene. And this was kind of a challenge to do an environment very quickly. I think I did it in just like 20 minutes or something, and really just use a lot of different elements that I had previously made to design a structure. So I tried to use a lot of column shapes and a lot of smaller pieces of architecture to really build up to something larger. I even made some tertiary structures on the side. And the important thing, I think, when working this way is to know that you can change where everything is in the end. You can move it around. But it becomes a, like I said, a very, very fast way to create new pieces of architecture. And that is it. Those are all my slides, and that's my kind of presentation showing my process. So I hope that is kind of helpful, and that explains kind of how I use VR in a day-to-day process. Yeah.
I mean, it definitely is, I think. And I think I work in a similar way, perhaps. But I guess there's also kind of a few like industry differences as well.
Totally.
Which I guess I'll kind of show you.
Yeah, that'd be great
right
to see.
now. Yeah. Sorry. So I guess like similar to you, I also model in Adobe Medium, but I guess like perhaps I'm more of a sculptor than an artist who sketches. So I personally like sculpting with the form and kind of really using the move tool. Actually, it's my
that's interesting.
I think it's my favorite tool in the Medium package. Most powerful tool, I think. But I think when I'm even working in VR, I realize that I'm doing less sculpting than I would perhaps like in Maya or Blender, but it becomes more of like a digital composition, like you said, kit bashing, kind of where we're just doing composition on digital assets that we've perhaps created before or have gone from the internet in one way or another. Likewise, I think I choose to like work with different colors just so I can layer them. Layer them in different images, layer them and then post-process them better in Blender. Well, and I guess your preferred choice of post-processing is Cinema 4D, but I guess I like Blender better.
Well, I mean, a lot of, I would say every artist in my studio uses Blender except for me. So it's definitely, something that I need to get a handle on. I think Blender is absolutely the way of the future. Like if people ask me, what 3D package should I jump into, I suggest them Blender now because it has so much going for it. So I definitely think that's a good direction to go in. Yeah,
definitely. I think well, I think Blender is gonna do. It can do almost anything. But yeah, basically, kind of model in Adobe Medium and then render it out in Blender. But I think like I have a less extensive library of stuff that I've done in VR. But I think at least I could show you some of at least what I'm thinking now about VR and how it might relate into fabrication and rationalizing these VR models into perhaps reality.
I see. Cool.
So I actually use this program. I don't think we use it anymore, but it's called ISOM.
Okay.
ISOM surface. It's probably been incorporated into CATIA now that but yeah, so that's kind of where I have done the paneling process for this VR model that I've done.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, but I've also thought about how to like actually create it in real life as well. Like with this VR model, I've actually thought about how to kind of
So is that printed? Is it printed or?
Yeah, it's printed.
That's great. Oh, very cool.
Yeah. It's like a like a prototype, you know. Like,
cool.
Actually, I have it here too.
Oh, that's awesome.
I don't know if you see.
Yeah, I do see it. That's very cool.
But I think this also weirdly enough relates to how you started in VR, which is like with the automotive industry. Like weirdly enough, I think it relates to the automotive industry and how they prototype it with the clay modeling and
absolutely
getting into it.
I think it needs to get a bit more precise before people. I mean, I have used Gravity Sketch. I feel like that one is really great for automotive stuff.
Yeah.
Personally, yeah, I feel like that. I mean, Medium I think is wonderful as well. I think that for a lot of industries, when it gets more precise, it'll be even more helpful. But for exploring, you know, early shapes and forms, absolutely, it's very important.
Yeah. And I think like in a certain point, we'll be able to kind of do what I guess this person is doing with Blade Runner, which is to create kind of these prototypes in VR, then actually making it in reality and then kind of working with it, whether it is for film or architecture.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of my slides on kind of where we differ. I think we're very similar in many sense.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess like I have a few questions for you. Like I guess why did you switch to virtual reality? Because you were also very skilled with kind of concept designs not in virtual reality, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it really as a tool. I wouldn't say that I solely use it. You know, like there's some projects that I know that I won't be able to use virtual reality for just because of the nature of the project. But the reason I initially switched into it was that I really was, just to be honest, bored of traditional modeling. I didn't feel, I'd sculpted in clay before, I drew a lot, I painted a lot, but when it came to physical modeling, say in ZBrush or some other application, I just felt very disconnected from what I was designing. I felt, you know, like I was designing from very far away. And when I saw VR initially, I'm trying to remember what the very first time I saw it was. I think I was maybe at a convention and tried a headset on and tried it on. And then I ended up getting, you know, the regular Rift later on. It just made so much sense to me as a designer of why you can design forms that way. It just really felt like it was natural. Like there was nothing limiting how you thought about design when you put that headset on and you went right into the design process. Whereas before, you know, if you're sculpting something on the computer, you have to translate it from a 3D image in your head onto a 2D surface, which is your screen, and then think about it in 3D again on your screen. When you're in VR, you have it in your head and you can physically think about it in the space that you're designing in. So it basically made it a lot more efficient for me, but also allowed me to sculpt things in a way that where the technology wasn't really limiting me anymore, because I really always sought after making organic shapes, and a lot of 3D modeling packages, you had to learn all these different maneuvers, different ways to sculpt with it. And I didn't want to have to think about that. I just wanted to get the shape I needed and to export that out so I can continue the design process. And for me at the time, it was really perfect. And I've used it for a ton of upcoming films that won't be released for a while. And we've used it in my studio. We use it for all sorts of stuff. It's not always the solution, because there are some projects that require a different source of sensibility. But I find for most things that I'm trying to create, it can be a good solution to use. So I essentially consider it like a tool as I do any other thing. Just like Photoshop is a tool for painting, or Octane Render is a tool for rendering, VR is a tool for designing. I wouldn't say it is the tool. I wouldn't say you need to know VR and only VR, but I think it is useful enough that people learn it and understand its capabilities so that they could use it in the future when they find a good fit for that.
Yeah, definitely. I feel the same way. I think I felt like traditional modeling was a bit too labor intensive in that sense. Like to model something like you would with that branch probably will take you around
A very
like an
long
hour
time, yeah.
or two.
Yeah.
But like in VR, it's maybe like 2 seconds or
Yeah, it's very,
5
very
minutes at most.
Yeah.
But like, what was it like explaining to someone that you were serious about VR modeling in the first place? Because I remember explaining it to people as well, like that, you know.
Well, in a way, I didn't necessarily have to like prove it to anybody, because I've never finished college. Essentially, I went to Art Center for 2 years, and then I started working in the industry. And at the time, I just wanted to learn more, even though I was working. I didn't really need to like prove to someone while I was working, but I just picked it up because I knew I could get good results. And I think once people saw the results that I was making, they understood, okay, this is why you're doing it that way. You know, I'd come to class with 20 sculpted 3D models where only 2 or 3 were required. And it was because I could do it that quickly and explore shapes that quickly that I was able to create this volume of work. When it came to explaining it to people, thankfully there were already some demos at the time. I had a laptop with me that was VR ready, so I could even bring it into class and show people, you know, and I did that a couple times. I would bring it, and then other people would try it on and see how it worked. And I would say everybody was very receptive. You know, the person that was teaching the vehicle design class, John Fry, I mean, he is like one of the lead designers in the automotive industry, and he was super receptive to it. You know, he was very receptive to me sculpting like that, and it was very interesting to him as well, even though that he came from, you know, a very much a traditional drawing and modeling background. So I wouldn't say I've met many people who are resistant to it. I've met people who think that other tools are more useful for them, which could absolutely be true. You know, I've never been someone to say that it's the only thing that's necessary. So a lot of people have said, well, you know, it can't do this, it can't do that. And that's absolutely true. You know, it cannot do everything that someone would need. But it can also do things that these other programs can't do as well. So I think it just depends what the end goal is, you know, what the end statement is. For me, if I need to, for instance, design a set that needs to be built, you know, in real life, which happens a lot, that is, you know, you have to measure everything down to the millimeter. You have to be very specific about the materials. I probably wouldn't use VR for the final design because it's much harder to measure the surfaces. You get thickness variations. But for the design process, if you're in the process of coming up with an interesting design, which is arguably, you know, much more important, is, for me at least, is getting something that is creative and original and groundbreaking. That to me is the most important part of the process, and that's where I would use it more so than the other sections.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think VR belongs in the ideation phase more than kind of the at the end of the design process.
Yeah.
I think the tool right now, it's for kind of ideation and the beginning of the design process rather than the end. I think traditional means like Maya and Blender or Rhino are better suited for like prototyping and all of that. So I mean, but has it like changed the way that you've designed? Like, has virtual reality changed?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think I would have been able to come up. I wouldn't say I wouldn't be able to come up with ideas, but there were ideas that I had while working inside of that space that I wouldn't have had modeling the way I used to model. There were shapes I'd made, designs, architecture, landscapes that just weren't they weren't things that I would have thought of really if I was just painting or just working on a 2D surface or within a regular modeling package. So for me, it's definitely useful in that sense where it causes you to think a bit more outside of the box. And because so often as designers, we're thinking very similarly to everybody else, anything that will push me outside my comfort zone when it comes to that sort of work is something that I'm happy to use in my pipeline. So a lot of people I know experiment with all sorts of different tools, whether it's AI tools that are on the horizon, that can generate designs, different 3D modeling packages that are using new sorts of algorithms, anything that really expands how you think about design and gives you a different result is something that I like to try at least to see if I can fit it in, because then you kind of separate yourself and you elevate your work to a different standard when you have something that's both functional and original and unique. So I would say it absolutely influenced a lot of the projects that I was on, because it just really brought new ideas to the table and new forms to the table that were otherwise inaccessible or would have taken a very long time to create. So yeah, absolutely, it influenced the way I designed.
Like new, I guess like the new way of doing probably will give you a new way of thinking, huh?
Yeah, I would say so.
So like, where do you see 3D modeling heading for the next 10 years? Like,
I mean, that's a big question. I mean, 3D modeling as a whole, I have no idea. I mean, there's so much going on in the space right now. I'm sure that at some point there will be an augmented reality app for sculpting available that, maybe you'll be able to put a much less cumbersome headset on. Maybe it's just glasses or something, and you're able to work in your office, collaborating with other people that also have this device on, and you're able to sculpt and design something together. I'm sure someone's already working on something like that or developing it. I think that'll be fantastic whenever it comes out. It's definitely something I would use. I think I do think virtual reality is something that's incredibly important, but I do think as well that augmented reality is where the industry will gravitate towards when there's more technology available. And the only reason I say that is that I do think that a combination of space, not completely submerging someone in their own zone, like with the headset, but being able to add an overlay with your model in it into a space you're already in. I think that is even more powerful in a way, and being able to promote collaboration with other people around you. I think that is going to be coming towards us in the future, and that'll be very, very useful. I'm sure, there'll be a lot of AI modeling tools developed. I mean, there already are a lot out there that, you can give them a sentence and they can try to model something that you're thinking of. They have an access to a huge database. I still think for the majority of design work that's needed, though, we'll need really good designers to solve it. But yeah, I would say there's a very strong future for AR and VR technologies when it comes to design. I mean, unfortunately, art and design is on the lower end in terms of funding of what they're used for. They're used for many other, tech industry jobs and tech industry programs, like medical and science and military even. But there are a lot of companies out there developing for art and design. So I do think it'll have a really bright future. As to what the specifics of that are, I either can't say because I am bound by NDAs to not discuss the technology, and I can just guess at what might be coming on the horizon. So I think that there is a very strong, AR component that someone will probably develop out there at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like the one big problem with VR, huh? Like the fact that you're kind of secluded your own zone. You're
Yes.
not, and it's kind of lonely there, like not being able to kind of collaborate on your design process
Yeah,
with other
absolutely.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, that is one of the things that holds me back sometimes from going into it, is that you have to wear this huge headset in order to do it. And I'm looking forward to the day where we don't have to do that anymore, and that you can have access to these tools without having to put this huge thing on. And I'm sure it's going to be within the next 5 years. Absolutely.
Yeah. This is actually quite ironic for, I guess, the architectural industry, because we went from previously blue foam modeling for modeling purposes, but then we moved from blue foam modeling into the digital digital program like Maya and Rhino. But now it seems like we're going back into the realm of blue foam and physical modeling with VR, and AR technologies, which is sort of like, I'm seeing it on a rise, where we're kind of like transitioning it back to kind of this way of the blue foam way of modeling by hand, and how like fast and organic it is to produce these objects.
Do a lot of people at SCI-Arc use VR modeling?
I would say like not a lot, but I guess like there's a lot that's a lot of people are starting to kind of adapt to VR modeling, and I guess AR as well. But I guess like AR is like, it takes a lot more work in the back end.
It might, I don't know. Like I haven't really seen many AR modeling programs yet myself. I've only used the VR side, but I think I would love to experiment with sometime.
Yeah. So do you think that we should teach VR modeling in addition to 3D modeling programs like Maya, Rhino, and Blender?
I think that it would be a great course to teach. I mean, I've taught before in schools, but I've never overseen a whole program. So I don't know the layout of class structures and necessarily what is the most important thing for architectural students to study. That being said, I think that as a student, it would have been very beneficial for me when I was studying to expose myself to a lot of different programs, different ways to design, to find what I was most comfortable with. And I think that giving students access to something like that would be very valuable. I wouldn't say that it might not be a necessary class to take, because I don't think that it is required that you know VR to break into any industry. But as an optional, class that is something that students can elect to take, I think that would be fantastic, because it's something that can enhance your design skill set. That being said, you need to, just like any other technique or software package, you need to know how to design before you can design in VR. You can't just jump into VR and expect to gain all this design knowledge. So it is really important that students have, I wouldn't say like to replace a class that's already there with a VR class, but having it as a class that students have access to, I think would absolutely be beneficial.
Yeah, like an elective.
Yeah, like an elective. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely can, I guess, increase the design output in the very least.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it'd be great.
But I guess like, how would you even like teach your class on that? Like how would you, since like they're kind of immersed in their own space, how would you even
Well, I
teach?
mean, I've taught a VR class before, and you just need to make sure you're in the same room with people. You know, when you say have 20 or 30 students in a class and they all are in their VR sets and sculpting, you can see what they're sculpting on their screen. So if they're struggling with something, you can jump in to help. You can do a demo in VR and project it onto, you know, a large screen for everybody to view. What I did when I taught a VR class was that I would assign, you know, depending on what the students' majors were, design certain number of objects. So with the end goal of creating, you know, 5 finished keyframes or key scenes at the end of the class, what are the breakdown steps that you need to get there where someone can learn the process? So maybe it's, you know, for 1 week design 20 different structures or 10 different structures using virtual reality. It would be showing them not just one program, but different programs that you can use, how to export those into another software that they already know, and really set up a some sort of system or process to get that final piece. So it wouldn't all be about necessarily VR for me. I think most of the class would be focused on that, but just as important as VR is how do you integrate that into a design pipeline, and how do you understand where you can incorporate VR? And because it's not just everywhere, it's very specific stages. And that's kind of how I would structure it. And when I did teach a class with it, it was very successful. And we ended up hiring some of the students out of that program. So yeah, I would say there's a lot of different ways to approach it. That's kind of how I would approach it, is showing industry examples of how it's used and modeling a class after creating industry quality pieces.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think definitely you have to kind of also show how to kind of get the model out of you, whether it be Adobe Medium or Gravity Sketch, and then how to work with it, right?
Yeah.
I find that to be like one of the key, I mean, where I spent the most time is like post-processing all these VR models into something that's better looking.
Yeah, definitely. That can take a while.
Yeah. So how long did it take you to master or like even get reasonably well in modeling in VR? Because for me, it actually was pretty fast. Like took about like a week just of trying and modeling different objects.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant to use the word master. I don't think I'm a master at anything, especially not VR. But if I was going to say how long did it take me where I was confident with my design skills inside the program, yeah, probably, you know, 4 or 5 days, a week. You know, I was definitely had enough experience where I knew all the functionalities. I was able to build something that I was very happy with, and I didn't have questions about how to use the program anymore. So I would say that because the UI and interfaces are pretty basic right now, there's not it's not overly complex. There's not 100 features you need to learn. It's very quick and easy to learn it. I would say that it's, you know, it's much easier than learning a lot of other softwares out there. So that's, I think, one of the benefits of it is that it's almost everybody can pick it up very quickly.
Yeah, and I think it needs to stay simple. Like, because there's no way to do it if it's like there's hundreds of features inside.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's like the one of the reasons why I'm not that interested in Gravity Sketch. It's just because how many features it has. Whereas in Adobe Medium, there's maybe like 3 features.
Yeah, no, that's true. And there's some other programs on the horizon that'll kind of expand into different areas as well. But you know, Gravity Sketch, I personally do really like Gravity Sketch for certain things. For architecture design, it's not my favorite right now. But for a lot of more sleeker surfaces and futuristic shapes, I feel that it's great to get the sort of curves in that program that you can't really get in a lot of other places. But you're right, it does, they're kind of fine tuning it, I feel like, towards the automotive industry. So a lot of it is heading in that direction right now.
Yeah, but I think for SCI-Arc, I don't know, maybe I'm just implying, but a lot of SCI-Arc projects, I don't know if you've seen the thesis projects that have come out.
I
of
haven't
SCI-Arc. Yeah, well, you should check it out.
Yeah, definitely.
But there's a lot of sleek surfaces that SCI-Arc students are doing. So perhaps like this gravity sketch also might be a program that SCI-Arc students should look at.
Yeah, they might find it interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess it's a lot faster to kind of get the hang of it in VR than you would perhaps with Rhino, Maya, or Blender.
Probably, yeah, it probably would take a lot longer to learn those, with all the different features.
I guess I find that that's what a lot of students get turned off by VR, is that they think it's going to be another, semester to learn how to do adequate modeling in VR. But I guess it's not the case. It's actually maybe 2 weekends of like modeling random stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the entry fee is that you have to pay a lot for a Rift. So if someone can borrow one of their friends first just to see if they like it, that'll probably help them a lot too.
Yeah, I guess that's one other gatekeeper.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you have any advice for students testing out new ways of designing in VR?
Yeah, just don't be afraid to fail. Being a student is the best. There's times I miss being a student just because you don't have that responsibility to, come up with groundbreaking designs all the time. You have time to really experiment and see what you enjoy doing. I would say, if I was to go back, I would experiment even more. I would try more different processes out, and VR is one of those for sure, but there's a lot of other things out there that are great as well. Algorithmic modeling, simulations, tons of different new groundbreaking tools that are really going to be important on the horizon for design. And data processing as it relates to architecture, even, there's a lot of really cool stuff out there that it can take a while to jump into once you're later in your career. But when you're a student, you have that time to really explore things. And so I would just not be afraid to fail and just try and experiment as much as you can while still making sure to develop a good design foundation. I think that the most important thing is to, whenever you're trying something new out, is to apply what you know of design to whatever your output medium is. So use it as a tool. Don't let the software control what your design is, but rather try to use what you know about design philosophy to influence what the program will create. And that is how you'll come up with something usable in the end, rather than, something that's more abstract. And I would say that's my biggest advice when it comes to, experimentation and trying all these new programs out.
Yeah, funny you say algorithmic design and AI, because actually that's kind of also another reason why I kind of was looking into VR, just because of all the weird things that the AI puts out, AI images, and trying to kind of model that in traditional software. That was a really, I guess that was really painful for me. And it was just out of sheer frustration. I wanted a new tool to kind of do the work. But I guess that's also where I guess you and I differ a little bit, where I think you think you think that perhaps VR you shouldn't let VR control you, but I guess my philosophy on it is whether you're using regular softwares or VR or even kind of pen and paper, there gets to a point where kind of the medium, I guess the medium does the work for you, and the medium is the message. In a little sense where you're not like you've arrived at a point where you realize you're kind of doing it in VR because you can or something like that.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Do you mean like you want the medium to control what your design is? Or?
No. But I think I view it as a necessary evil, where it's it has influences on you whether you like it or not. And
no, I agree with that. I just mean that you don't want to use a tool just because it gives you an interesting shape. You want to put functionality into it. You want to take what you know about design, about shape design and shape language, and having an end result, and make sure that you create something that's usable in the end, rather than for instance, just using a program to create something totally abstract because that's what it can do well. I feel it's more about infusing something of what you've learned and some end goal into it to create a functional piece of design. And like it's definitely going to have an influence, because in a lot of time when you make something in VR or Houdini or one of these other programs, it's easy to tell what program was used to make it. But there's a difference between using a program just because it gives you cool shapes and using something for a purpose and for a reason. And that's what I'm just a fan of, is like making sure that you go into it with some sort of end goal in mind, some sort of purpose for why you're using the tool. And it doesn't always have to be, but it's your people are going to get the most out of it when you use it with an end goal, when you have a purpose for using it. That's all I'm saying.
Definitely. I mean, I guess, that's one thing perhaps also to be wary of. You could really get lost in modeling in VR.
Yeah.
I've gotten lost myself a couple of times. Yeah. Cool. Well, it's really nice having you here, Finian.
Yeah, it was great talking.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, of course.
Really appreciate it. And James, thanks for leading such a great discussion.
Cool.
Well, that concludes the first day of the DTP show. I want to thank all of our guests, James Chen and Finian McManus, Reza Salehi and Marceline Gao, and Carlos Sturkin and Mark Fostergage. Join us tomorrow for another exciting round of discussions. We have Seymour Politan and Nick Cernicek, Matthew Ridgway and Jorge Otero Pilos, and Valeria Hospital and Andres Jaque. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.